Stop being weak. 7 Weak Habits. A boxer once threw a fight on purpose, took a beating he didn't have to take, and the entire arena booed him without knowing that the real fight had already happened hours earlier, in a hotel room, and he had already lost it before he ever stepped into the ring. That is what weakness actually looks like, almost every single time. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic collapse in public. It arrives as a small, private surrender that happened earlier, quieter, somewhere no one was watching, and by the time anyone sees the consequence, the real moment of weakness is already long over and already forgotten by everyone except the man who lived it. We will return to that boxer later in this script, because his story is the cleanest possible illustration of something almost no one wants to admit. Weak habits are not weak moments. They are decisions, repeated so many times in private that they eventually start making themselves, until a man wakes up one day inside a life built entirely from 1,000 small surrenders he never consciously noticed himself making. Most men think strength is the absence of weakness. It isn't. Strength is what's left after you've gone looking for every weak habit quietly running your life and replaced it, one at a time, with something that actually serves the man you're trying to become instead of the man fear and comfort keep trying to quietly install in his place. Seneca wrote to a friend, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Most weakness isn't even a response to real danger anymore. It's a habit, formed once under real pressure, that kept running long after the pressure disappeared, like a fire alarm that never got reset after the actual fire went out. This is inner steel. And today we are going through 7 weak habits, the ones quietly running far more lives than most men would ever admit, each one carried by a true story of a person who either got destroyed by that exact habit or fought their way out of it, so you can see precisely what it costs to keep it, and what it takes to finally kill it. If you're ready to find out which of these 7 habits has been quietly running your own life, subscribe to Inner Steel now, because that's exactly what the rest of this channel is built to help you do. Let's begin. Weak Habit 1. Seeking approval before making a decision. Vincent van Gogh sold exactly 1 painting during his entire lifetime, despite producing more than 2,000 works of art across roughly a decade of furious, dedicated output. He was rejected, dismissed, and mocked by nearly every art critic, dealer, and fellow painter who encountered his work while he was alive to hear about it, and he struggled financially for his entire adult life, dependent for years on financial support from his brother Theo simply to keep painting at all. What makes Van Gogh's story relevant here is not the famous tragedy of his mental health struggles, which have been discussed at length elsewhere and deserve their own careful treatment rather than a passing mention. It is the specific, repeated choice he made, documented extensively in the hundreds of surviving letters between him and his brother, to continue developing his own distinctive, radical style of painting despite receiving almost no external validation whatsoever for doing so across his entire working life. Contemporary critics dismissed his thick, visible brushstrokes and unusual color choices as the work of an amateur who hadn't yet learned proper technique. Fellow painters in his circle, even those who liked him personally, frequently suggested he tone down his style to something more conventional and saleable. Theo himself, who loved his brother deeply and supported him financially without complaint, gently questioned the commercial wisdom of the direction Van Gogh kept pushing further into with each passing year. Van Gogh continued anyway, refusing to let the complete absence of approval function as evidence that his direction was wrong. He wrote to Theo at one point that he would rather paint and be wrong than not paint at all, waiting for someone else's permission to begin, a sentiment that captures precisely the weak habit this point is built around: the tendency to treat the absence of approval as proof of failure, rather than recognizing that approval and correctness are frequently unrelated to each other entirely. Especially when you're doing something genuinely new that the people around you simply don't have a framework to recognize yet. He died in 1890, having sold that single painting, with a body of work that the art world would only fully recognize and celebrate decades after his death, eventually becoming some of the most valuable and influential paintings in the entire history of the medium. The approval he never received while alive arrived in overwhelming, almost absurd abundance after he was gone. Proof, in the starkest possible terms, that waiting for approval before committing to a direction you genuinely believe in can mean waiting for something that was never going to arrive on any timeline that could have actually helped you while it mattered. The weak habit here is subtle because it disguises itself as humility or caution. It feels responsible to wait for someone else's blessing before committing fully to a decision. In practice, it is frequently just fear wearing the costume of patience, outsourcing your own judgment to people who have no more access to the correct answer than you do, and in some cases considerably less, because they aren't the ones who have to actually live inside the consequences of the choice. Weak habit 2. Avoiding difficult conversations until they become crises. Robert Oppenheimer, leading the Manhattan Project during the development of the atomic bomb, observed and later reflected publicly on a specific institutional failure that he believed had compounded enormously over time: the consistent avoidance, at every level of the project's vast bureaucracy, of difficult conversations about the ethical and safety dimensions of what they were collectively building. Conversations that kept being deferred under the pressure of wartime urgency until they had accumulated into questions of a scale almost impossible to address adequately after the fact. Within the scientific team itself, considerable private disagreement existed throughout the project about exactly how the weapon should eventually be used, whether a demonstration to Japan might achieve surrender without an actual deployment against a populated city, and what obligations the scientists who built it might have regarding its future use and proliferation. Many of these conversations happened only partially, in private corners and informal conversations between colleagues, rather than through the kind of direct, structured confrontation with project leadership and government officials that the stakes genuinely demanded. Oppenheimer himself, by his own later account, frequently deferred the hardest of these conversations, telling himself there would be a better, calmer moment to raise them once the immediate technical pressures of the project had eased, a moment that, given the wartime timeline driving everything forward, never actually arrived before the weapon was used. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer became famously and publicly tormented by the implications of what had been built, reportedly telling President Truman directly that he felt he had blood on his hands, a statement Truman reportedly found presumptuous and dismissed sharply. Oppenheimer spent much of the remainder of his life advocating, sometimes effectively and sometimes not, for international control of nuclear weapons and arms limitation, conversations he would later suggest, in various reflective interviews, should have happened with considerably more urgency and directness earlier in the project, before the weapon's use had become an almost foregone conclusion driven by institutional momentum rather than a conversation anyone had deliberately and fully had. This particular weak habit is one of the most universally relatable on this entire list, because nearly everyone recognizes the pattern in their own life immediately upon hearing it described. The conversation you know needs to happen with a partner, a business associate, a family member, or yourself, that gets pushed to next week, then next month, then becomes something you've simply stopped consciously thinking about at all, until the underlying issue it concerned has grown so large that the eventual confrontation, when it finally and unavoidably arrives, is far more damaging and far more difficult than the original conversation would ever have been if it had simply happened on time, when it was still manageable and still relatively small. If there's a conversation you've been avoiding that's quietly grown bigger every week you've put it off, that pattern is exactly what we're here to help you break. Subscribe to Inner Steel if you're ready to actually have it. Weak habit 3. Letting comfort make decisions that discipline should be making. Robert Falcon Scott led a British expedition to the South Pole in 1911 and 1912, racing against a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen for the distinction of being first to reach it. Scott's expedition is now studied extensively, not merely as a story of brave but ultimately tragic exploration, but as a detailed case study in how a long accumulation of small, comfort-driven decisions can compound into catastrophic failure, in sharp contrast against the competing team that made disciplined choices at almost every equivalent decision point along the way. Amundsen's team relied heavily on dogs for transportation, used simple, well-tested equipment that his team had personally trained with extensively in conditions closely matching what they would actually face. and maintained a deliberately conservative daily travel pace specifically designed to preserve their physical reserves over the entire grueling distance rather than risk depleting them through impressive but unsustainable bursts of effort early on. Scott's team, by contrast, relied substantially on motorized sledges that frequently broke down in the extreme cold and on ponies that struggled badly in deep snow, used equipment that had not been adequately tested under the specific conditions they would actually face, and at several documented points pushed for faster daily progress than their physical condition and food supplies could realistically sustain over the full distance of the journey, repeatedly choosing the option that felt more comfortable or more impressively ambitious in the moment over the more disciplined, conservative option that the underlying math of the expedition actually demanded. Scott's team did reach the South Pole, only to discover Amundsen's team had beaten them there by more than a month. On the brutal return journey, plagued by exhaustion, inadequate food rationing decisions made earlier in the planning process, and worsening weather that a more conservative pace might have given them more margin to absorb, every member of Scott's polar party died, the last entries in Scott's own diary recording a stark, painfully clear-eyed account of the accumulated decisions that had brought them to that final, fatal point, including his own later acknowledgement that several earlier choices, each individually defensible and each one feeling reasonable in the moment it was made, had compounded together into a situation from which there was ultimately no recovery available to them. This weak habit is corrosive precisely because no single instance of it ever feels significant enough, on its own, to justify real alarm. Sleeping in instead of training. Eating the convenient meal instead of the disciplined one. Choosing the comfortable conversation over the necessary one. Taking the easier route through a project instead of the more rigorous one the actual stakes demand. Each individual choice, examined entirely in isolation, looks reasonable and forgivable. It is only the accumulated pattern across months and years, examined honestly and all at once the way Scott's diary forces a reader to examine it, that reveals comfort had quietly been making decisions discipline should have been making the entire time, compounding small failures into one that, by the time it becomes visible, is often too large to survive. Weak habit 4, needing to be right more than needing to be effective. Robert E. Lee, by most detailed historical accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg, made the decision on the third day of fighting to order what became known as Pickett's Charge, a direct frontal assault across open ground against heavily fortified Union positions, against the explicit and detailed objections of his own senior subordinate commander, General James Longstreet, who argued forcefully that the attack as planned would result in catastrophic, likely decisive casualties without a realistic chance of success given the terrain and the defensive positions involved. Lee, who had won an extraordinary string of previous battles through aggressive, often unconventional tactics that had repeatedly succeeded against the conventional military wisdom of his era, proceeded with the attack largely as originally planned despite Longstreet's documented and increasingly desperate objections on the morning of the assault itself. Several historians studying the decision in detail have suggested that Lee's confidence, built and repeatedly reinforced by his prior battlefield successes using exactly this kind of bold, aggressive approach, made it genuinely difficult for him to fully absorb evidence in that specific moment suggesting this particular situation called for a fundamentally different approach than the one that had served him so consistently and so impressively in the past. The attack failed catastrophically, with Confederate forces suffering enormous casualties for essentially no tactical gain, a defeat from which the Army of Northern Virginia would never genuinely recover for the remainder of the war, and which most historians now treat as the war's decisive turning point in favor of the Union. Lee himself, in the immediate aftermath, reportedly told his retreating, shattered soldiers directly that the failure was entirely his own responsibility rather than theirs, a notably honest and accountable acknowledgement that nonetheless arrived only after the irreversible cost of the decision had already been paid in full by thousands of men who would never return home. This particular weak habit operates with unusual power specifically on people who have already experienced real, substantial success, because that prior success creates a powerful, almost gravitational pull toward trusting your own established judgment and your own demonstrated track record over new evidence suggesting the current specific situation genuinely calls for something different. The habit isn't a general lack of confidence, it is, somewhat counterintuitively, frequently the inverse, an excess of confidence built on real prior accomplishment. That becomes a weakness specifically because it makes a person slower than they should be to recognize the narrow, specific moments when their usual, previously successful approach is the wrong tool for this particular situation, regardless of how well it has served them in every previous situation that came before it. Weak habit 5. Avoiding risk so completely that you guarantee the outcome you were trying to avoid. Eastman Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. Developed by one of their own engineers, Stephen Sasson, who built a working prototype and demonstrated it directly to company executives, showing them a technology that would eventually transform photography entirely and globally. Kodak's leadership, by multiple later accounts including Sasson's own, recognized clearly that the technology worked and understood its long-term implications reasonably well even at that early stage, but made a deliberate, sustained decision over the following decades to avoid meaningfully investing in or aggressively developing digital photography, specifically because doing so risked cannibalizing their existing, enormously profitable film and chemical processing business that had made the company one of the most successful and dominant corporations in American business history for the better part of a century. This avoidance of risk was not laziness or incompetence on the part of Kodak's leadership, who were by most accounts sophisticated, experienced business executives making what felt, at every individual decision point along the way, like a reasonable and defensible choice to protect a genuinely massive, currently functioning, highly profitable revenue stream rather than risk it by aggressively pursuing an unproven new technology that might fail to find a market or might simply cannibalize their existing profits without adequately replacing them. Each individual year of underinvestment in digital technology, examined in isolation the way Kodak's leadership examined it at the time, looked like prudent, defensible risk management protecting shareholders from an uncertain bet. Compounded across more than 2 decades, this consistent pattern of risk avoidance left Kodak catastrophically unprepared as digital photography technology matured rapidly throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and was aggressively adopted by competitors who had nothing comparable to lose by moving quickly into the new technology. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, having invented the very technology that ultimately destroyed its core business, undone specifically by a sustained, years-long habit of avoiding the risk inherent in disrupting itself before someone else inevitably did it for them, with considerably less concern for Kodak's own institutional comfort along the way. This weak habit is a profound and instructive paradox precisely because risk avoidance is so frequently and so confidently marketed as wisdom, as the mature and responsible choice that careful, experienced people make. Sometimes it genuinely is exactly that. But there exists a very real category of situation, frequently encountered in business, in personal relationships, and in individual career decisions alike, where avoiding all risk simply guarantees, with absolute and total certainty, the very outcome a person was originally trying to avoid by playing it safe in the first place. Because the world keeps moving regardless of what any single person or company decides to risk, and standing still while everything around you changes is its own form of decisive, irreversible action, dressed up convincingly as caution. If you've been avoiding a risk specifically because the comfortable status quo feels safer, even though some part of you suspects that comfort is quietly running out, that's worth examining honestly. And if inner steel is helping you do exactly that, subscribe, because we're only halfway through these 7 habits. Weak habit 6. Letting your past failure write the story of your future attempt. Abraham Lincoln, before becoming president, experienced a string of professional and personal failures that, examined in isolation at almost any single point along the way, would have given most reasonable people ample justification to conclude their political ambitions had simply run their course. He failed in business as a young man, accumulating debts that took him years to fully pay off. He lost multiple elections across his early political career, including a notably painful loss in a Senate race against Stephen Douglas that received considerable national attention and appeared, at the time, to many observers including Lincoln himself, like a fairly decisive verdict on the ceiling of his political prospects. Lincoln, by the accounts of those who knew him during these difficult periods and by his own later reflective writing, experienced what would today likely be recognized and discussed as genuine clinical depression at multiple points throughout these repeated setbacks, including periods where friends grew seriously concerned for his immediate safety and stayed close to him deliberately to ensure he wasn't left entirely alone. What distinguishes Lincoln's eventual path from countless other talented people whose careers simply ended quietly after comparable accumulated failures is the specific, repeated choice he made, documented across his own letters and the accounts of those around him, to treat each individual failure as information about that specific attempt rather than as a permanent, settled verdict on his fundamental capability or his future prospects more broadly. After the painful Senate loss to Douglas, Lincoln reportedly told supporters who urged him to abandon politics entirely that the path was not quite as smooth or as simple as he had originally hoped, but that he was personally not yet ready to give up, language that reflects a deliberate, conscious refusal to let that specific defeat function as a final, permanent verdict on what might still be genuinely possible for him going forward, even though virtually every external signal available at the time suggested otherwise to nearly everyone observing his career from outside. He won the presidency just 2 years after that supposedly career-ending Senate defeat, going on to lead the nation through its single most severe and consequential crisis, and is now remembered as among the most significant and successful presidents in the country's entire history. This weak habit operates quietly and insidiously because failure genuinely does carry real, useful information that deserves serious consideration. The mistake lies specifically in treating that information as a permanent verdict on identity and future capability, rather than as a narrower, more limited verdict on one specific attempt, made under one specific set of circumstances that will never again be perfectly replicated. Lincoln's failures were entirely real and were not minimized or denied by him in any way. What he refused to do was allow them to write the ending of a story that, by every reasonable external measure available to anyone observing his career honestly at the time, looked very much like it might already be over. Weak habit 7. Surrendering quietly when no one is watching, and calling it private strength. This brings us, finally, to the boxer from the very opening of this script. Throughout the history of professional boxing, there exist well-documented cases of fighters deliberately losing matches they were fully capable of winning, often under pressure from organized crime figures who had placed substantial bets on the opposite outcome and threatened the fighter or his family if he failed to comply with the arrangement. A practice sufficiently well known within the sport's history to have its own established terminology, and its own extensively documented historical cases that have been studied, written about, and dramatized for decades since. What makes these specific cases relevant to this final point is not the external coercion involved, which is its own serious and separate issue deserving treatment on its own terms, but the internal experience repeatedly described by fighters who went through this exact situation and later spoke about it publicly, the specific, private moment, often occurring well before the actual fight itself. In a hotel room or a locker room with absolutely no audience present, no cameras, no crowd, no one watching at all, where the fighter made the actual decision to surrender the contest before he had even stepped into the ring to begin it. The public fight that followed, however brutal or however publicly booed by an unaware crowd convinced they were simply watching an inferior performance, was frequently described by these fighters themselves, in later interviews and memoirs, as something closer to a formality, a performance of a decision that had genuinely already been made hours or even days earlier, alone, with no audience present to witness the actual surrender when it actually occurred. Several fighters who experienced exactly this kind of pressure and went through with the arranged loss later described a specific, lasting psychological cost that proved considerably more damaging than the financial losses or even the damage to their professional reputation that followed. The private knowledge, carried quietly for years or even decades afterward, that they had once given up entirely while no one was watching. And that this fact, hidden successfully from the public record for years in many documented cases, remained permanently, privately true regardless of whether anyone else ever discovered it. Several of these men later spoke candidly about how that single private surrender, witnessed by no one but themselves, quietly corroded their own self-respect and their own sense of their fundamental character in ways that public failures, witnessed and judged openly by an audience, never managed to do nearly as severely. This is, in many ways, the most dangerous weak habit covered anywhere in this entire script, precisely because it is the only one specifically and structurally designed to remain invisible to literally everyone except the person committing it. You can quit on a goal privately and simply tell people you decided to pursue something else instead. You can give less than your genuine full effort on a project and let the resulting outcome look like a reasonable result of circumstances beyond your control rather than a deliberate, internal choice to surrender early. You can fold quietly under pressure in a moment that no camera, no colleague, and no family member will ever witness or know occurred, and walk away from that moment with your public reputation completely and entirely intact. But you will know. The boxer in the hotel room knew, every single day for the remainder of his life and career, regardless of how convincingly the public performance that followed managed to disguise what had actually already happened in private hours earlier. And that private knowledge, carried silently and indefinitely, is frequently far more corrosive to a person's actual character over time than any single public failure could ever manage to be, precisely because there is no external accountability available to push back against it, nothing forcing an honest reckoning with what actually happened. Nothing except the person's own conscience quietly keeping score in a ledger no one else will ever be permitted to see or audit. This is why the habit of private surrender deserves to be treated with the same seriousness as any public failure, even though, by its very nature, it will frequently never be publicly known or judged by anyone else at all. The standard you actually hold yourself to in the moments genuinely no one else will ever witness is, in the most meaningful and lasting sense available, the real and complete measure of your actual character, considerably more accurate and more honest than the standard you perform for an audience that is, by definition, only ever watching the parts of the story you've chosen to let them see. Closing. 7 weak habits. 7 different costs, paid by 7 different people in 7 entirely different arenas of life. Van Gogh showed us what it costs to need approval before committing fully to a direction you genuinely believe in, and what waiting for approval that was never going to arrive on a useful timeline can do to an entire life's work while that life is still being lived. Oppenheimer and the scientists around him showed us what accumulates when difficult conversations keep getting deferred for a calmer moment that institutional momentum never actually provides. Scott showed us what comfort quietly does to a plan when it's allowed to make decisions discipline should have been making at every single decision point along an unforgiving journey. Lee showed us that prior success can make a mind slower than it should be to recognize the specific moment when its usual, previously reliable approach has become the wrong tool for this particular situation. Kodak showed us that avoiding all risk doesn't actually protect you from the outcome you fear. It frequently guarantees that exact outcome with total certainty, just on a longer and more painful timeline than the risk itself would have required. Lincoln showed us that a string of real, undeniable failures is information about specific attempts, not a permanent verdict on what remains genuinely possible going forward. And the boxer showed us that the most dangerous surrenders are the private ones nobody else will ever witness, because the standard you hold yourself to when no one is watching is the truest, most honest measure of who you actually are underneath every public performance. None of these 7 habits announce themselves clearly when they first take root in a life. They arrive quietly, disguised as reasonable caution, as understandable deference, as harmless procrastination, as defensible confidence, as prudent risk management, as simple bad luck, as private business that concerns no one else. By the time their accumulated cost becomes visible to anyone, including the person who built that cost one small decision at a time, the habit has frequently been running the show for years already, completely unexamined and almost entirely unchallenged. The good news, if there is meaningful good news buried inside 7 stories that include genuine catastrophe and real human cost, is that every single one of these 7 habits can be identified, examined honestly, and deliberately replaced, the same way they were originally built, through small, repeated, mostly private decisions that nobody else will ever specifically notice or applaud you for making. Accumulated patiently over time until they become the new, quietly dominant pattern running. your life instead of the old one you finally decided to stop tolerating. If this gave you something honest to examine in your own life today, subscribe to Inner Steel. This channel exists to help you find exactly these patterns and replace them, one story and one principle at a time, every single week, and there is considerably more of this waiting for you whenever you're ready for the next one. Stop being weak. Not as a single dramatic moment of transformation, but as 7 specific, identifiable habits, examined honestly one at a time, and quietly replace starting today.